Some bonds run deeper than blood, the kind forged between a man and his loyal companion through 40 winters of survival. When that sacred trust gets violated by a stranger's cruel joke, justice has a way of finding its own path. Jedediah Pike was a mountain man who'd spent decades in the Rockies with his German shepherd, Brimstone. This wasn't just any dog. Brimstone was trained to hunt grizzly bears. So when a cocky stranger stepped off the train and decided to kick Brimstone for laughs, he had no idea what kind of reckoning he'd just unleashed. The folks in Dry Gulch were about to witness something they'd never forget. What happens when you mess with a bear-hunting dog and his battle-tested master? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun hung low over Dry Gulch, casting long shadows across the weathered boardwalks where dust devils danced between the saloon and the general store. This wasn't a place where strangers lingered. Most folks who found themselves here were either passing through or had run out of places to run. But for those who called it home, Dry Gulch represented something precious in a world that seemed to be changing faster than a man could keep up with. It was a place where a handshake still meant something, where debts were honored, and where respect wasn't given lightly, but once earned. It lasted, every third Thursday of the month, like clockwork. The townspeople would find themselves glancing toward the mountain trail that wound down from the high country. They weren't watching for the mail coach or expecting any particular delivery. They were waiting for Jedediah Pike and his German shepherd, Brimstone, to make their monthly pilgrimage into civilization. Jedediah was a man carved from the mountains themselves, tall, lean, with shoulders that had carried countless burdens across terrain that would break lesser men. His beard, once dark as a moonless night, now showed streaks of silver that caught the light like frost on pine needles. Deep lines mapped his weathered face, each one telling a story of harsh winters, scorching summers, and the kind of solitude that either breaks a man or makes him stronger than steel. In Jedediah's case, it had forged him into something approaching legend. Around his neck, barely visible beneath his worn flannel shirt, hung a necklace of bear claws, 7 in total, each one taken from a different grizzly over the years. The largest claw, positioned at the center, came from the first bear he'd ever killed. He'd been barely 25 then, green as spring grass and foolish enough to think the mountains would bend to his will. That particular grizzly had taught him otherwise, nearly taking his life in the process. But it had also taught him something invaluable about respect, about the delicate balance between predator and prey, and about the kind of partnership that could mean the difference between life and death in the wilderness. That was where Brimstone came in. The German shepherd walked at Jedediah's side with the easy confidence of a creature born to dangerous work. At 5 years old, Brimstone was in his prime 90 pounds of muscle, intelligence, and carefully channeled aggression. His coat was a rich sable, darker along the back and shoulders, with intelligent brown eyes that missed nothing. But it wasn't his size or his coloring that made Brimstone special. It was his training from the time Brimstone was 8 weeks old. Jedediah had been preparing him for life in grizzly country. While most German shepherds learned to fetch sticks and sit on command, Brimstone learned to track wounded bears through dense undergrowth, to circle and harass a grizzly without getting close enough to be killed, and most importantly, to distinguish between a bluffing bear and one that meant business. It was dangerous work that required split-second decisions and absolute trust between man and dog. The training had started simple enough scent work with bear hair and scat, building confidence around the overwhelming musk that could paralyze an inexperienced dog. Then came the mock hunts, teaching Brimstone to work at a distance, to use barks and movement to distract while Jedediah positioned himself for a clean shot. They'd practiced in all weather, at all times of day, until man and dog could communicate with barely a glance. The real test had come during Brimstone's second winter, when they'd encountered a massive boar grizzly that had been raiding food caches throughout the region. The bear was smart, aggressive, and desperate, a combination that made it incredibly dangerous. While Jedediah tracked the animal through a blizzard, Brimstone had saved his life by alerting him to an ambush. The bear had doubled back, lying in wait behind a fallen log. Without Brimstone's warning growl, Jedediah would have walked straight into the grizzly's killing zone. They'd taken that bear together, and in the process, they'd become something more than just man and dog. They'd become partners in the truest sense, two souls bound by shared danger and mutual dependence. The townspeople of Dry Gulch understood this bond, even if they couldn't fully comprehend its depth. They'd seen Jedediah and Brimstone work together during the occasional emergency, like the time old Henrik's grandson had gotten lost in the foothills during a spring storm, while search parties floundered in the rocky terrain. Jedediah and Brimstone had found the boy in less than 6 hours. Following a scent trail that had been nearly washed away by the rain, Martha Connolly, who ran the general store with the kind of no-nonsense efficiency that kept small towns functioning, always made sure to have Jedediah's usual supplies ready when he made his monthly visits. Coffee beans, flour, salt, ammunition, and a few other essentials that couldn't be hunted, trapped, or gathered in high country. She'd been doing this for nearly 15 years. Ever since Jedediah had first appeared in Dry Gulch, like a ghost materializing from the mountains. "Afternoon, Jed," she'd say, the same greeting every time. Warm but respectful of his natural reserve. "Got your usual order packed up. Coffee's fresh roasted. Came in on yesterday's supply run." Martha was one of the few people who could claim something approaching friendship with the mountain man. She'd earned it through small kindnesses, never pushing for conversation he wasn't ready to give, never asking questions about his past, always treating Brimstone with the same respect she showed Jedediah himself. In return, Jedediah had quietly helped her through some difficult times, like the winter her husband died, when he'd made sure her wood pile never got low and her store stayed stocked with fresh meat. The other regulars in town had their own relationships with Jedediah, built on mutual respect and the understanding that some men needed more space than others. Doc Henley, who served as the town's physician, veterinarian, and occasional dentist, always checked Brimstone's eyes and ears when they visited, more out of professional curiosity than medical necessity. The dog was in perfect health, but Doc appreciated the chance to examine an animal trained to such a high level. "That's a fine animal you've got there, Jed," Doc would say, running practiced hands over Brimstone's shoulders and legs. Muscle tone like a racehorse, reflexes sharp as a cat's. "Whatever you're doing up there in those mountains, it's working." Even Sheriff Tom Bradley, a man who'd spent 30 years keeping peace in various frontier towns, treated Jedediah with the kind of deference usually reserved for visiting judges or territorial governors. There was something about the mountain man that commanded respect, a quiet competence that spoke of a man who'd faced down death and lived to tell about it. On this particular Thursday, as the afternoon light began to take on the golden quality that photographers spent fortunes trying to capture, Jedediah and Brimstone made their way down the familiar trail toward Dry Gulch. The dog ranged ahead, nose working the wind, alert for the 1,000 scents that could tell a story to those who knew how to read them. Jedediah followed at his steady, ground-eating pace, his eyes automatically cataloging the landscape for changes, new growth, animal sign, weather patterns that might affect his journey home. They moved together with the easy rhythm of a partnership, refined by years of practice. Brimstone would investigate interesting scents, always circling back to check in with his human partner. Jedediah would pause to examine tracks or study the sky, secure in the knowledge that nothing could approach them undetected, while Brimstone was on duty dot as they crested the final ridge before town. Jedediah could see the familiar collection of buildings spread out below them like a child's toy set. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and he could make out figures moving along the main street. The afternoon train had already arrived. He could see the dark shape of the locomotive at the small station, steam still rising from its stack. Something about that train bothered him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what. Maybe it was the way Brimstone's ears had pricked forward when they'd heard the distant whistle. Or maybe it was just the restless feeling that had been growing in his chest for the past week. Change was coming to this part of the territory. He'd seen the signs in increased railroad traffic, surveyor marks on trees, and the subtle shifts in animal behavior that spoke of human encroachment. But for now, Dry Gulch remained what it had always been, a place where a man could conduct his business with dignity and return to his chosen solitude without interference. Jedediah shouldered his pack and started down the trail toward town, Brimstone falling into position at his left side. Neither of them knew that this monthly visit would be different from all the others. Neither of them knew that a stranger had stepped off that afternoon, trained with enough arrogance to challenge the unwritten laws that governed life in places like Dry Gulch, and neither of them could have predicted that before the sun set, they would be facing the kind of confrontation that would be talked about for years to come. The bear claw necklace rested against Jedediah's chest as he walked, each claw a reminder of lessons learned in blood and survival. Soon, those lessons would be tested in ways he never could have imagined. The afternoon train wheezed to a stop at Dry Gulch's modest station with the mechanical exhaustion of a machine that had traveled too many miles over questionable track. Steam hissed from the engine's joints as the conductor swung down to place his step stool, preparing for the usual exchange of mail, supplies, and the occasional passenger who had business in this corner of nowhere. Most days, nobody got off the train. Today was different. Randolph Morrison stepped down from the passenger car with the calculated confidence of a man who believed the world owed him deference. His black leather coat, still stiff from the shop where he'd bought it 3 days prior in Denver, caught the sunlight like polished obsidian. Everything about him spoke of Easter money and Western ambitions, from his perfectly blocked hat to his boots that had never known honest work. In his vest pocket, a silver pocket watch gleamed, engraved with his initials, R, in elaborate script, a gift from his father to commemorate his graduation from Harvard Law. Morrison surveyed Dry Gulch with the expression of a man examining livestock at market. The town was smaller than he'd expected, more primitive than the railroad promotional materials had suggested. But that could work in his favor. These frontier settlements were always hungry for development, always eager to embrace progress when it came with enough money attached. He'd come to Dry Gulch on behalf of the Consolidated Mining and Development Company, tasked with acquiring mineral rights and water access for a planned expansion into the mountain regions. The company had given him a generous expense account and broad authority to negotiate, confident that a Harvard-educated lawyer could outmaneuver any collection of simple frontier folk. What Morrison saw as he walked toward the main street only reinforced his assumptions. Weathered buildings that had seen better decades, streets that turned to mud with the first rain, people dressed in practical clothes that had been mended more than once. These were exactly the kind of folks who would jump at the chance to sell their land for more money than they'd ever seen in one place. The locals watched him with the polite curiosity that greeted any stranger. But Morrison interpreted their attention as awe. He was accustomed to making an impression, and he dressed specifically to project success and authority. Let them see what real prosperity looked like. It would make the negotiations that much easier. He paused outside the saloon, consulting his pocket watch with deliberate ceremony. 4:15 in the afternoon, plenty of time to take the measure of the local establishment before securing accommodations for the night. Tomorrow he would begin the serious business of acquisition. But today was about reconnaissance. That was when he noticed the old man and his dog approaching from the mountain trail. Morrison had always prided himself on his ability to read people quickly. a skill that had served him well in Boston's competitive legal circles. The man walking toward town was clearly a local character, probably a prospector or trapper, judging by his rough clothing and unkempt appearance. The kind of colorful frontier figure that would make good stories when he returned to civilization. The dog, a large German shepherd, walked beside the man with what Morrison interpreted as typical canine subservience. Just another working animal in a place where everything seemed to revolve around basic survival rather than genuine sophistication. As the pair drew closer, Morrison felt a familiar urge to establish dominance that had served him well in boardrooms and courthouses. These people needed to understand from the beginning that he wasn't just another visitor. He was someone who commanded respect, someone with the power to change their little town forever. The opportunity presented itself when the old man stopped outside Martha Connolly's general store, leaving his dog sitting patiently on the boardwalk while he went inside. The animal was large and alert, but to Morrison's Eastern-educated eyes, it was just another example of the crude utility that characterized everything about frontier life. A big, small crowd had gathered to watch the stranger. Locals emerging from shops and homes to get a look at the well-dressed newcomer. Morrison recognized the moment for what it was, a chance to demonstrate his superiority while teaching these simple people about proper social order. He approached the waiting dog with theatrical casualness, making sure his movements were visible to the watching townspeople. The animal looked up at him with intelligent brown eyes, but Morrison saw only the dumb patience of a creature waiting for its master's return. "Well now," Morrison announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Looks like someone's forgotten to train their mutt proper manners." He gestured dismissively at Brimstone. In civilized places, animals show respect to their betters. The watching crowd had gone very quiet, but Morrison interpreted their silence as anticipation. They were waiting to see what this impressive stranger would do next. He decided to give them a demonstration they wouldn't forget. With theatrical flair, Morrison drew back his right foot and delivered what he intended as a disciplinary kick to the dog's ribs. Not hard enough to cause real injury, but sufficient to establish the proper hierarchy between a Harvard-educated gentleman and a common frontier animal. His boot connected with Brimstone's side with a solid thump. The reaction was not what Morrison had expected. Instead of yelping or cowering, Brimstone absorbed the blow and rose to his feet with liquid grace. The dog's entire demeanor changed in an instant, from patient waiting to coiled lethality. His ears flattened against his skull, lips pulled back to reveal teeth designed for tearing flesh, and a low growl emerged from his chest that seemed to vibrate in the bones of everyone who heard it. This wasn't the whimpering submission of a beaten cur. This was the controlled fury of a predator deciding whether prey was worth the effort of killing. Morrison stumbled backward, suddenly aware that he'd made some kind of terrible miscalculation. The dog wasn't advancing yet, but every line of its body spoke of violence barely held in check. Those brown eyes, which he dismissed as dumb animal patience, now burned with an intelligence that was calculating angles and distances. The crowd's silence had taken on a different quality. Where Morrison had expected approval or amusement, he found something approaching horror. These people weren't looking at him with admiration for his dominance. They were looking at him like he'd just lit a fuse on a stick of dynamite. "Jesus Christ, mister," someone whispered from the boardwalk. "What have you done?" That was when Jedediah Pike emerged from the general store. The mountain man took in the scene with a single glance, his dog's aggressive posture, the stranger backing away with fear dawning in his eyes. The townspeople frozen in place like witnesses to a catastrophe. He didn't need to ask what had happened. The story was written in the tension that crackled in the air like electricity before a lightning strike. Jedediah moved with deliberate calm, setting down his supplies and walking to Brimstone's side. He placed one weathered hand on the dog's head, and the growling stopped instantly. though the animal remained coiled and ready. "Easy, boy," Jedediah said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of absolute partnership. "I see him." Morrison found himself face to face with a man whose eyes held depths he couldn't fathom. There was no anger there, no visible emotion at all. Just a cold assessment that seemed to weigh his soul and find it wanting. "You kicked my dog?" Jedediah asked, the question delivered in the same tone he might use to inquire about the weather. Morrison's throat had gone dry, but his Eastern arrogance reasserted itself. "Now see here, old man. That animal needs to learn proper respect for his betters." "Where I come from, where you come from," Jedediah interrupted softly. "They probably don't train dogs to hunt grizzly bears." The words fell into the afternoon air like stones dropping into still water. Morrison felt the weight of every gaze upon him, felt the sudden understanding that he'd stepped into something far beyond his comprehension. He reached for his pocket watch, a gesture meant to restore his sense of authority and civilized superiority. The familiar weight of the engraved silver helped steady his nerves. "I don't appreciate threats, old man," Morrison said, trying to inject command into his voice. "I suggest you control your animal before someone gets hurt." Jedediah studied him for a long moment, and Morrison had the uncomfortable feeling that he was being catalogued like a specimen in a collection. "Mister," Jedediah said finally, "you just threatened a dog that's killed bears bigger than you'll ever be. And you did it as a joke." He paused, letting that sink in. "Question is, what are you planning to do for an encore?" The silence that followed Jedediah's words stretched like a bowstring drawn to its breaking point. Morrison stood frozen, his hand still clutching the pocket watch, while the weight of his mistake settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Around them, the townspeople watched with the fascinated horror of spectators at a bullfight, knowing they were about to witness either triumph or tragedy. Sheriff Tom Bradley chose that moment to emerge from his office, drawn by the unusual crowd and the palpable tension that seemed to thicken the very air. At 62, Bradley had seen enough confrontations to recognize when a situation balanced on the knife's edge between resolution and bloodshed. His practiced eye took in the scene instantly, the well-dressed stranger pale as winter snow, Jedediah standing calm as mountain stone, and Brimstone still coiled like a spring loaded with deadly potential. "Afternoon, Jed," Bradley said carefully, his voice pitched to carry reassurance without showing weakness. "Everything all right here?" Jedediah didn't take his eyes off Morrison, but his voice remained level when he answered. Stranger here thought it'd be amusing to kick Brimstone, just helping him understand the kind of dog he decided to mess with. Bradley's weathered face tightened imperceptibly. In 30 years of law enforcement, he'd learned that some mistakes couldn't be undone with apologies or fines. Kicking a man's dog was serious business anywhere, but kicking Jedediah Pike's bear hunting companion was the kind of foolishness that could turn a quiet Thursday into a funeral by Friday. "That so?" Bradley asked, turning his attention to Morrison. "Son, you want to tell me your side of this?" Morrison straightened his shoulders, drawing on years of courtroom experience to project confidence he didn't feel. The sheriff looked like a reasonable man. Surely someone in law enforcement would understand the need for proper social order. "Sheriff, I'm Randolph Morrison, attorney for the Consolidated Mining and Development Company." He reached into his coat pocket, producing a leather portfolio with practiced efficiency. "I'm here on official business, and I won't be intimidated by threats from some backwoods hermit and his mongrel." The word mongrel hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Someone sucked in a sharp breath, and Martha Connolly shook her head with the expression of a woman watching a man dig his own grave. With enthusiastic determination, Bradley accepted the credentials with professional courtesy, but his voice carried a warning when he spoke. "Mr. Morrison, you're welcome in Dry Gulch as long as you conduct yourself peacefully, but I need to make something clear. What you just did isn't considered acceptable behavior in these parts. I disciplined an animal that was improperly supervised, Morrison replied, his lawyer's training taking over. In any civilized jurisdiction, pet owners are responsible for controlling their animals in public spaces. That dog was clearly not under proper restraint. Doc Henley, who had been quietly observing from the steps of his office, let out a sound that might have been laughter if it hadn't been so grim. "Mister, that dog doesn't need restraint. He needs respect. There's a difference." Morrison turned toward the doctor, grateful to find someone who might appreciate rational discourse. "Doctor, surely you understand the importance of proper animal control. What if children had been present? What if that animal had acted aggressively?" "Son," Doc Henley said quietly, "if Brimstone had acted aggressively, we'd be scraping what's left of you off the boardwalk with a shovel. The fact that you're still breathing is proof the dog has better manners than you do." The truth of those words settled over Morrison like cold water. He looked around at the faces surrounding him. Not one showed sympathy or understanding for his position. These people were looking at him like he'd committed some unforgivable sin against their deepest values. Jedediah had remained silent through the exchange, but now he stepped forward slightly. The movement was small, almost casual, but it focused every eye on him like iron filings drawn to a magnet. "Sheriff," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being heard the first time he spoke. "I'm not looking for trouble. Never have been. But this man needs to understand something important before he goes any further with whatever business brought him here." Bradley nodded carefully. "What's that, Jed?" "Respect isn't something you take in these parts. It's something you earn. And disrespecting a man's partner, whether that partner walks on 2 legs or 4, is about the quickest way to lose any chance of earning it." Morrison felt his Eastern-educated indignation rising again. "Now see here, I won't be lectured by some mountain hermit about respect. I represent significant business interests that could bring prosperity to this godforsaken place. You people should be grateful for the opportunities I'm offering." The words hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire, acrid and unwelcome. Martha Connolly crossed her arms over her chest, while Doc Henley shook his head with the weary expression of a man who'd seen this particular brand of arrogance before. "What kind of opportunities?" Sheriff Bradley asked, though his tone suggested he might already suspect the answer. Morrison straightened, sensing a chance to regain control of the situation. "Consolidated Mining is prepared to offer generous compensation for mineral rights and water access throughout this region. We're talking about real money, enough to transform this entire community." "Into what?" The question came from Martha, sharp as a blade. "Into a modern, prosperous settlement with real economic opportunity. Railroad connections, steady employment, access to markets and manufactured goods. Everything you need to join the 19th century instead of hiding from it." Jedediah's laugh was soft as wind through pine needles, but it carried an edge that made Morrison's skin crawl. "Mister, we're not hiding from anything. We're just particular about what we let into our lives. And we're particular about who we do business with," added Martha. "Especially folks who think kicking a man's dog is a good way to introduce themselves." Morrison could feel the situation slipping away from him like sand through his fingers. In Boston, credentials and corporate backing opened doors and commanded attention. Here, his impressive portfolio seemed to carry all the weight of yesterday's newspaper. "Look," he said, trying a different approach. "Perhaps we got off on the wrong foot. I'm willing to overlook this incident if we can discuss my proposals in a civilized manner. I'm authorized to make very generous offers. The only thing you need to be authorized for right now," Jedediah said quietly, "is an apology to my dog." The suggestion hit Morrison like a slap across the face. Apologize to an animal? The very idea offended every principle of social hierarchy he'd been raised to respect. A Harvard-educated attorney didn't grovel before some frontier cur. no matter how many bears it might have supposedly hunted. "I'll do no such thing," he said, his voice rising with indignation. "I refuse to be humiliated by a collection of backwards." He never finished the sentence. Jedediah's hand moved to rest lightly on Brimstone's head, and the dog's ears pricked forward with sudden interest. The message was clear without words being spoken. The conversation was one poorly chosen phrase away from becoming something much more serious. Sheriff Bradley stepped between them, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Mr. Morrison, I think it might be wise for you to take some time to consider your next words very carefully. Dry Gulch is a peaceful town, and I aim to keep it that way." Morrison looked around at the circle of hostile faces, feeling more isolated than he'd ever felt in his life. These people lived by rules he didn't understand, valued things he'd been taught to dismiss. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice was beginning to whisper that maybe, just maybe, he'd bitten off considerably more than he could chew. The standoff might have continued indefinitely if Martha Connolly hadn't chosen that moment to assert the practical wisdom that kept small towns functioning. She stepped forward with the no-nonsense authority of a woman who'd managed both inventory and temperaments for the better part of 2 decades. "Sheriff, it's getting on toward evening, and we all have work to do," she announced firmly. "Mr. Morrison, you're going to need a place to stay the night. The boarding house is clean, and the meals are decent. Mrs. Patterson will take good care of you, provided you mind your manners." She turned her attention to Jedediah, her expression softening with genuine warmth. "Jed, your usual supplies are ready. Coffee's fresh roasted, just like you prefer. And I set aside some of those hard candies that Brimstone likes." The mention of treats for his dog seemed to ease some of the tension in Jedediah's shoulders. He nodded his thanks to Martha, then fixed Morrison with a steady gaze that held no malice but plenty of warning. "Mister, you came here thinking you could buy whatever you wanted and push around anyone who got in your way," Jedediah said quietly. "Maybe that works where you come from. But out here, a man's word and his character matter more than the size of his bank account. And how he treats animals and folks who can't fight back, that tells you everything you need to know about what kind of man he really is." Morrison felt heat rising in his cheeks, but something in Jedediah's tone kept him from responding with his usual indignation. There was no mockery in the mountain man's voice, no attempt to humiliate or belittle. Just a statement of facts as he saw them, delivered with the quiet certainty of a man who'd lived long enough to understand human nature in all its varieties. Sheriff Bradley cleared his throat diplomatically. "Mr. Morrison, why don't you get settled at the boarding house? Give everyone a chance to cool down. Tomorrow you can present your business proposals proper-like, if that's what you've come to do." It was clearly a dismissal, though wrapped in the polite language of suggestion. Morrison understood that his immediate options were limited. He could accept the sheriff's guidance with whatever dignity he could salvage, or he could continue to escalate a situation that was already badly damaged. "Very well," he said, trying to inject authority back into his voice. "But I want it understood that I won't tolerate any further threats or intimidation. I have important business to conduct here, and you'll have your chance to conduct it," Bradley assured him. "Tomorrow, when folks have had time to think things through." As Morrison gathered his traveling bag and headed toward the boarding house, he could feel every eye in the street following his movement. The weight of their collective judgment pressed down on him like a physical force. And for the first time since stepping off the train, he began to question whether his corporate masters had adequately prepared him for the realities of frontier negotiations. Mrs. Patterson, a matronly woman in her 60s with kind eyes and graying hair pinned back in a practical bun, greeted him at the boarding house with professional courtesy tinged by obvious caution. Word of his encounter had clearly already reached her, but she maintained a hospitality that was her livelihood. "Mr. Morrison, welcome to Dry Gulch. I have a nice room on the 2nd floor. Overlooks the street, so you can keep an eye on the comings and goings. Supper's at 6, breakfast at 7. We run a quiet house here. No drinking, no gambling, no loud talking after 9 o'clock. The rules were stated matter-of-factly, but Morrison caught the underlying message. He was being watched, evaluated, held to standards that had nothing to do with his legal credentials or corporate backing. His room was spartanly furnished, but scrupulously clean, a narrow bed with a thick quilt, a washstand with pitcher and basin, a chair positioned near the window, and a small desk suitable for correspondence. The simplicity was actually restful after the ornate excess he was accustomed to in city hotels, though he wouldn't have admitted it aloud. From his window, Morrison could see Jedediah completing his business at the general store, methodically checking his supplies while Brimstone waited with the patient alertness that seemed to define the animal. Other townspeople approached the mountain man with obvious respect, exchanging brief words and occasional handshakes. Children waved from doorways, and Morrison noticed that Jedediah always acknowledged them with a touch to his hat. This wasn't the relationship between a hermit and civilization that Morrison had expected. These people genuinely cared about Jedediah Pike, and he clearly returned that sentiment in his own reserved way. The mountain man wasn't an outcast or a curiosity. He was an integral part of their community, valued for qualities that had nothing to do with wealth or education. The realization struck Morrison like a cold wind. In his world, respect followed money and position as inevitably as night followed day. Here, he was discovering that respect had to be earned through character and conduct. And his opening performance had been an unmitigated disaster. He pulled out a sheet of the boarding house's writing paper and began composing a telegram to his superiors at Consolidated Mining. The message was harder to write than he'd expected. How did you explain to profit-minded executives that their carefully planned acquisition strategy had been derailed by a dog and an old man who lived in the mountains? After several false starts, he settled on. Initial negotiations more complex than anticipated. Local customs require careful consideration. May need additional time to establish proper relationships. Will report progress shortly. Morrison. It was vague enough to buy him time without admitting outright failure, though he suspected his bosses would read between the lines. They'd sent him here because they believed frontier communities would be easily intimidated or impressed by Eastern sophistication. The reality was proving considerably more complicated. As evening shadows began to lengthen across the main street, Morrison watched Jedediah and Brimstone prepare for their return journey to the mountains. The ritual was obviously familiar to everyone present, handshakes and brief farewells. Martha pressing a small package into Jedediah's hands with maternal insistence. Children calling goodbye from safe distances. The mountain man shouldered his pack and supplies with practiced efficiency, then paused to look directly up at Morrison's window. Even from that distance, Morrison could feel the weight of that gaze, not hostile, but unmistakably alert. A reminder that Jedediah Pike was watching, evaluating, remembering. Then man and dog turned toward the mountain trail and walked out of town with the same quiet dignity they brought with them. Within minutes, they disappeared into the gathering dusk, leaving Morrison alone with the uncomfortable knowledge that he'd made an enemy of someone he couldn't afford to underestimate. Supper at Mrs. Patterson's table was a subdued affair. Conversation limited to weather and local news delivered in polite but distant tones. Morrison ate mechanically, tasting nothing, while his mind churned through possible strategies for salvaging his mission. One thing had become abundantly clear: traditional negotiation tactics weren't going to work in dry Gulch. These people operated by different rules, valued different things. If he was going to succeed, he needed to learn those rules quickly. The question was whether his pride would let him. Morrison spent a restless night in the narrow boarding house bed, his sleep broken by unfamiliar sounds, the distant howl of coyotes, the creak of settling timber, and the whisper of wind through gaps in the siding that no city building would have tolerated. Each time he woke, his mind returned to the confrontation in the street and the uncomfortable realization that he was operating without the advantages he'd taken for granted his entire adult life. Dawn came early in Dry Gulch, announced by a rooster's crow and the gradual increase of activity on the street below. Morrison dressed carefully, choosing his second-best suit and ensuring his appearance projected competence without the overt display of wealth that had clearly worked against him the previous day. At breakfast, Mrs. Patterson served him eggs, bacon, and biscuits with fresh butter, all of it prepared with the kind of attention to quality that spoke of genuine pride in the work. The other boarders, a traveling tinker and an elderly prospector named Caleb, acknowledged him with polite nods, but maintained the cautious distance that told him his reputation had preceded him. "Sleep well, Mr. Morrison?" Mrs. Patterson asked as she refilled his coffee cup with brew that was stronger and more flavorful than anything he'd tasted in Boston's finest hotels. "Well enough, thank you," he replied, then hesitated before adding, "Mrs. Patterson, I wonder if you might help me understand something. Yesterday's events didn't go as I'd hoped. I seem to have misjudged local customs." The boarding house proprietor studied him with shrewd eyes that had evaluated countless travelers over the years. "Mr. Morrison, you kicked Jedediah Pike's dog. In these parts, that's not a matter of custom. It's a matter of basic human decency. A man's partnership with his animal tells you everything you need to know about his character. But surely you understand the proper animal control." "Son," interrupted Caleb. "The old prospector, let me tell you something about that dog. 2 winters back, my grandson got lost in a blizzard up in the high country. Search parties looked for 3 days without finding so much as a footprint. Then Jed and Brimstone showed up, and they had that boy home safe inside of 6 hours. Dog tracked him through snow and wind that would have defeated a whole pack of hounds." Morrison set down his coffee cup carefully. "I had no way of knowing the animal's history or training." "That's just it," Mrs. Patterson said gently. "You didn't ask. You didn't observe. You just assumed you knew better than folks who've lived here all their lives." She paused, studying his face. "Question is, are you planning to keep making assumptions, or are you willing to learn?" The challenge was delivered kindly but unmistakably. Morrison found himself at a crossroads he hadn't anticipated. He could retreat into wounded pride and corporate authority, or he could admit that his approach had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. "What would you suggest I do?" he asked, the words coming harder than any legal brief he'd ever composed. Caleb chuckled, the sound surprisingly warm. "Well, for starters, you might consider that apology Jed mentioned. Won't cost you nothing, and it might buy you enough goodwill to actually conduct your business. Apologize to a dog?" Morrison's Eastern sensibilities rebelled at the notion. "Apologize to Jedediah through his dog," Mrs. Patterson corrected. "Show that you understand what that partnership means to him. Show that you respect something he values." Morrison spent the morning walking the streets of Dry Gulch, observing with eyes unclouded by assumptions for the first time since his arrival. What he saw challenged every preconception he brought with him from the corporate boardrooms of Boston. This wasn't a collection of ignorant frontier folk waiting to be enlightened by Eastern civilization. These were competent, thoughtful people who built a functioning community in challenging circumstances. The buildings might be simple, but they were well constructed and carefully maintained. The people might dress practically, but their conversations revealed intelligence, humor, and genuine concern for one another's welfare. At Martha Connolly's general store, he watched her conduct business with a precision that would have impressed any city merchant. She knew her inventory by heart, understood her customers' needs, and managed credit and cash flow with an expertise born of necessity and experience. Doc Henley emerged from his office to treat a rancher's injured horse with skill that spoke of formal training combined with years of practical experience. The care he showed the animal and the respect The rancher showed for his expertise highlighted the value placed on competence over credentials in this community. Sheriff. Bradley walked his rounds with the easy confidence of a man who maintained order through respect rather than force. People greeted him warmly, children approached without fear, and Morrison began to understand that authority here was earned rather than imposed. By midday, Morrison had reached a conclusion that would have horrified his corporate supervisors. He needed to start over completely. Not just his negotiation strategy, but his entire approach to understanding what these people valued and what they might be willing to exchange it for. He found Sheriff Bradley in his office, reviewing wanted posters with methodical attention. The sheriff looked up as Morrison entered, his expression professionally neutral. "Sheriff, I've been thinking about yesterday's events," Morrison began carefully. "I believe I may have approached this situation incorrectly." Bradley leaned back in his chair, gesturing toward the visitor's seat. "How so, Mr. Morrison?" "I came here assuming that my corporate backing and legal credentials would command automatic respect. I realize now that was both arrogant and foolish." "That's a start," Bradley acknowledged. "What do you plan to do about it?" Morrison had been dreading this moment, but he forced himself to meet the sheriff's eyes directly. "I need to make things right with Mr. Pike. The question is, how do I do that? He won't be back to town for a month." But Bradley's expression softened slightly, the first sign of approval Morrison had seen from any local authority figure. "Yet's got a cabin about 15 miles up the mountain trail. It's not an easy ride, and he doesn't welcome uninvited visitors. But if a man had something important enough to say, something that couldn't wait for the next monthly visit, Yet's not unreasonable." "You think he'd see me?" "I think he'd listen to what you had to say," Bradley corrected. "Whether he believe you depends entirely on whether you're telling the truth." Morrison spent the afternoon making careful preparations. He rented a horse from the livery stable, a sturdy mountain-bred Mare named Ginger, who could handle rough terrain. He purchased supplies for the journey from Martha Connolly, who packed them with professional efficiency while maintaining her cool but civil demeanor. "Mr. Morrison," she said as she secured the supplies to his saddle, "Yet's place isn't hard to find if you stay on the main trail. But you need to understand something. You'll be entering his world up there. His rules, his territory. He's earned the right to live as he chooses, and he won't appreciate anyone trying to change that." "I understand," Morrison replied, though he wondered if he truly did as he prepared to mount Ginger for the journey into the mountains. Morrison caught sight of his reflection in the general store window. The well-dressed lawyer who'd stepped off yesterday's train was still there, but something had changed in his expression. The arrogant certainty was gone, replaced by something that might have been the beginning of wisdom. The trail wound up through pine and aspen, growing narrower and steeper with each mile. With every step his horse took away from Dry Gulch, Morrison felt himself moving further from the familiar world of contracts and corporations into something older and more fundamental, a place where a man's character mattered more than his credentials, and where respect had to be earned one honest interaction at a time. The mountain trail tested Morrison in ways no boardroom battle ever had. What had seemed like a reasonable 15-mile ride from the comfort of Dry Gulch's main street revealed itself as a grueling journey through terrain that demanded respect, patience, and skills he'd never needed to develop. Ginger proved her worth with every careful step, navigating loose shale and narrow ledges that would have defeated a less experienced mountain horse. 3 hours into the climb, Morrison's city-softened muscles ached in ways that reminded him of just how far he'd traveled from his comfortable Boston existence. The thin mountain air left him slightly breathless, and the vast silence of the wilderness, broken only by wind through the pines, and Ginger's steady breathing felt both peaceful and intimidating. He packed writing materials in his saddlebags, thinking he might compose another telegram to his corporate supervisors during rest stops. But as the miles accumulated and the civilization of Dry Gulch fell away behind him, Morrison found himself questioning what message he could possibly send that would adequately explain his current situation. The senior partners at Consolidated Mining had sent him west with explicit instructions: secure mineral rights and water access through whatever combination of financial incentives and legal pressure proved necessary. They'd provided him with ample authority and resources. Confident that frontier communities would be easily managed by an experienced attorney with corporate backing, none of their strategic planning had accounted for the possibility that he might find himself riding alone through mountain wilderness to apologize to a hermit whose dog he'd kicked in a moment of spectacular misjudgment. His afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the pine-covered slopes. Morrison caught his first glimpse of Jedediah Pike's homestead. The cabin sat in a natural clearing beside a clear-running creek, positioned to take advantage of morning sun while remaining sheltered from the worst of winter winds. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and he could see a well-tended garden plot, a sturdy lean-to shelter, and various outbuildings that spoke of self-sufficient mountain living. What struck him most was the sense of belonging. This wasn't a temporary camp or a crude shelter thrown together by someone hiding from civilization. This was a home carefully planned and lovingly maintained by someone who'd chosen this life with full understanding of its demands and rewards. As Ginger picked her way down the final slope toward the cabin, Morrison heard the deep bark that announced his arrival. Brimstone emerged from behind one of the outbuildings, moving with the controlled alertness that had impressed and terrified Morrison during their first encounter. The dog didn't charge or threaten. Instead, he positioned himself between the approaching stranger and the cabin, then settled into a watchful crouch that radiated readiness. Jedediah Pike appeared in the cabin doorway moments later, rifle held casually but ready. He studied Morrison and his approach with the same calm assessment that had unnerved the lawyer during their confrontation in town. "Mr. Morrison," Jedediah called across the clearing, his voice carrying easily in the thin mountain air. "That's far enough for now. State your business." Morrison brought Ginger to a halt at the edge of the clearing. Well, within speaking distance, but respectfully outside what any reasonable person would consider the mountain man's personal space. He dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible, acutely aware that he was completely at the mercy of a man who had every reason to dislike him. "Mr. Pike, I came to apologize," Morrison called back, his voice steady despite the nervousness that tightened his throat, "and to ask if I might speak with you about something important." Jedediah considered this for a long moment, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Finally, he lowered the rifle and stepped fully out of the cabin. "You rode 15 miles up a mountain trail to apologize?" he asked, and Morrison caught something that might have been mild surprise in his tone. "Yes, sir. What I did yesterday was wrong, and I wanted you to know that I understand it now." Jedediah walked slowly across the clearing, Brimstone falling into step beside him with the easy coordination of long partnership. When they stopped about 10 feet away, Morrison got his first close look at the mountain man's home territory. Everything he could see spoke of competence, planning, and hard work. The cabin's chinking was perfect, the roof showed recent repairs, and the various tools and equipment visible around the clearing were all well maintained and purposefully placed. This wasn't the crude Hermitage he'd expected, but the sophisticated homestead of a man who understood exactly what mountain living required. "That's a long ride to make for an apology," Jedediah observed. "Must be something else brought you all the way up here." Morrison nodded carefully. "There is. But the apology comes first, and it's genuine. I kicked your dog because I wanted to establish dominance over what I thought were simple country folk. I was wrong about the situation, wrong about your people, and wrong about your dog. I'm sorry." Jedediah's eyes didn't leave Morrison's face during this speech. And the lawyer had the uncomfortable sensation of being weighed and measured by standards he didn't fully understand. "Brimstone," Jedediah said quietly, and the dog's ears pricked forward attentively. "What do you think about Mr. Morrison's apology?" The German shepherd rose and approached Morrison with careful deliberation. The lawyer held perfectly still as the animal circled him once, nose working, clearly cataloging scents and assessing threat levels. When Brimstone returned to his original position and settled back onto his haunches without signs of aggression, Jedediah nodded slightly. "Dog's got good judgment," he said simply. "Better than most people, in my experience. He says you're scared but not lying. That's a start." Morrison felt a rush of relief so profound it surprised him. "Thank you. Both of you." "Don't thank me yet," Jedediah warned. "You said there was something else you wanted to discuss. That apology might buy you a hearing, but it won't necessarily buy you agreement." Morrison reached slowly into his jacket pocket, producing a folded document that represented hours of careful thought and revision. "Mr. Pike, I work for a mining company that wants to expand into this region. Yesterday, I came to Dry Gulch, planning to acquire rights and access through standard business practices. After what happened, and after spending time observing your community, I realized that approach won't work." He held out the document, which Jedediah accepted with obvious curiosity. "That's a proposal, but not the kind my company sent me to make. It's what I think might actually serve everyone's interests, including yours." Jedediah unfolded the paper and read it with careful attention, his expression revealing nothing. When he finished, he looked up with something that might have been respect. "This is quite different from what I'd expect from a mining company," he said finally. "It is, and I'll probably be fired for presenting it. But yesterday taught me that there are things more important than corporate advancement." The mountain man studied Morrison for another long moment, then gestured toward the cabin. "Coffee's hot. Why don't you come inside and tell me exactly what you think you're proposing?" As Morrison followed Jedediah toward the cabin, Brimstone falling into step beside them, he realized that something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer the confident corporate representative who'd stepped off the train in Dry Gulch. He was a man who'd had his assumptions shattered and was trying to rebuild his understanding of what constituted real value and authentic respect. The worn leather journal that sat on Jedediah's kitchen table caught his eye as they entered 40 years of wilderness observations and hard-won wisdom, bound in covers that had weathered countless mountain seasons. Morrison found himself wondering what lessons those pages might contain for a man learning to navigate a world where character mattered more than credentials. Inside Jedediah's cabin, Morrison discovered a space that challenged every assumption he'd made about mountain hermits and their living conditions. The interior was spacious, warm, and meticulously organized. Hand-hewn furniture showed the work of a master craftsman, while shelves lined with carefully labeled jars spoke of methodical preparation and attention to detail. Most surprising were the books, dozens of them, covering subjects from natural philosophy to engineering to military strategy. Jedediah poured coffee from a pot that had been simmering on the wood stove, the brew dark and fragrant with a richness that spoke of beans carefully selected and properly roasted. He gestured for Morrison to take a seat at the solid oak table where his worn leather journal lay open, pages filled with precise handwriting and detailed sketches. "Before we discuss your proposal," Jedediah said, settling into the chair across from Morrison, "there's something you need to understand about this situation. Something that changes everything you think you know." Morrison set down his coffee cup, struck by the gravity in the mountain man's tone. "What do you mean?" Jedediah reached across the table and opened a wooden box that Morrison hadn't noticed before. From it, he extracted a collection of items that made the lawyer's blood run cold. Surveyor's marks, metal stakes, and official-looking documents bearing the seal of the Consolidated Mining and Development Company. "Your people have been up here for weeks," Jedediah said quietly. marking boundaries, testing soil and water, mapping access routes. They didn't bother asking permission or even announcing their presence. They just came and started treating this land like they already owned it. Morrison stared at the evidence spread before him, his mind racing. That's impossible. I'm the advance representative. I was supposed to make first contact. Were you? Jedediah's voice carried no accusation, only a weary understanding that spoke of long experience with duplicity. Or were you supposed to be the polite face they could point to when folks started asking questions about trespassing and illegal surveying? The implications hit Morrison like a physical blow. He'd been sent to Dry Gulch not as a legitimate negotiator, but as a distraction, a well-dressed lawyer whose presence would suggest corporate respectability, while other teams conducted actual operations under cover of darkness and secrecy. I didn't know, Morrison said, and was surprised to hear how hollow the words sounded. They told me I was handling initial negotiations. Jedediah reached into the box again and produced a telegraph form, its contents stark and unambiguous. Surveying complete. Legal assessment unnecessary. Proceed with acquisition protocols. Ignore local representative. The message was dated the day before Morrison's arrival in Dry Gulch. This was intercepted by friends of mine who worked the telegraph lines, Jedediah explained. Seems your company was planning to move forward with or without your recommendations. Morrison felt the careful structure of his professional world crumbling around him. He'd prided himself on being an essential part of Consolidated Mining's expansion strategy, believing his legal expertise and negotiation skills made him valuable to the company's success. The reality was far more brutal. He was expendable window dressing, a convenient scapegoat who could be blamed for any complications that arose during the acquisition process. There's more, Jedediah continued, extracting additional documents from the box. Water rights filings, mineral claims, even preliminary construction permits. Your company's been planning this operation for months, maybe years. They've got backing from railroad interests, territorial politicians, and federal land office officials. Morrison examined the papers with growing horror. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Consolidated Mining hadn't just sent surveyors and claim jumpers. They'd orchestrated a comprehensive assault on local sovereignty, complete with corrupted officials and predetermined legal outcomes. Why are you showing me this? Morrison asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Because you apologized to my dog, Jedediah replied simply, and because sometimes a man deserves to know when he's being used. The profound betrayal by his own company was almost too much to process, but Morrison forced himself to focus on the larger implications. Mr. Pike, if what you're showing me is accurate, then everything I proposed is meaningless. My company has already decided to take what they want regardless of local consent. Now you're beginning to understand the situation. Morrison stood and walked to the cabin's single window, staring out at the peaceful mountain landscape that was apparently under siege by forces he'd unknowingly been serving. The irony was bitter. He'd come to apologize for his arrogance, only to discover that his real crime was being naive enough to believe he had any actual authority. What do you plan to do about it? He asked, turning back to face Jedediah. The mountain man's expression had hardened into something that reminded Morrison of the controlled lethality he'd seen in Brimstone during their confrontation. I've been wondering about that myself. See, this land isn't just my home. It's been my sanctuary for 40 years. And some of it belongs to other folks too. Homesteaders, trappers, even a few Cheyenne families who've been living here since before any white man ever set foot in these mountains. Jedediah rose and moved to a gun rack mounted on the far wall, his hand resting lightly on a rifle that showed the careful maintenance of a tool that might be needed at any moment. Your company assumes that because we're scattered and isolated, we can't organize effective resistance. They're counting on picking us off one by one through legal manipulation and corporate pressure. What they don't understand is that mountain folk have been dealing with predators a lot longer than mining companies have existed. Morrison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Mr. Pike, you're talking about armed resistance. That's not a fight you can win against corporate resources. Maybe not in a courtroom or a boardroom, Jedediah agreed. But we're not in your world anymore, Mr. Morrison. We're in mine. And up here, different rules apply. The mountain man returned to the table and began spreading out detailed topographical maps that Morrison recognized as far superior to anything in his company's possession. Red marks indicated strategic positions, water sources, and natural choke points that could control access to the entire region. 40 years in these mountains teaches a man things that don't get covered in law school, Jedediah continued. Like how to make a small force seem larger than it is. Like how to use terrain to neutralize superior numbers. Like how to convince invaders that the cost of victory might be higher than they're willing to pay. Morrison stared at the maps, realizing that he was looking at the work of someone with genuine military experience. The positioning and strategic thinking revealed knowledge that went far beyond civilian self-defense. "You served," he said, the statement carrying the weight of sudden understanding. 43rd Ohio Infantry. 4 years fighting folks who knew their own ground better than we knew ours. Learned some hard lessons about what happens when you underestimate local knowledge and determination. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place for Morrison. Jedediah Pike wasn't just a hermit who happened to live in the mountains. He was a veteran who'd chosen isolation after experiencing the worst that organized conflict could offer. And now his sanctuary was under threat from the kind of corporate warfare that showed no more respect for individual rights than any military campaign. "Mr. Pike, there has to be another way. Legal challenges, political pressure, public attention, all controlled by the same interests backing your company," Jedediah interrupted. "The territorial governor's in their pocket. The federal land office is processing their claims, and the newspapers are owned by railroad money. Your legal system serves those who pay for it, not those who need protection from it." Morrison sank back into his chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was learning. Every principle he'd been raised to believe about law, order, and civilized society was being stripped away to reveal the brutal reality of power and money, determining outcomes regardless of justice or legality. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally. Jedediah studied him with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see straight through to a man's soul. "I want to know what kind of man you really are, Mr. Morrison. Are you going to go back to Dry Gulch and send your company a report about how well your negotiations are proceeding? Or are you going to do something about what you've learned here?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a campfire, impossible to ignore, carrying implications that would determine not just Morrison's immediate future, but the kind of man he would prove himself to be when tested by circumstances he'd never imagined facing. The weight of Jedediah's question settled on Morrison like a mantle of responsibility he'd never expected to bear. Outside the cabin windows, the mountain evening was painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, but inside, the atmosphere had grown heavy with the gravity of decisions that could reshape multiple lives. Morrison found himself studying the intercepted documents again, not because he needed to verify their authenticity. Their legitimacy was obvious, but because he was trying to comprehend the full scope of his own unwitting complicity. Every day he'd spent in Boston, reviewing contracts and preparing for what he believed was a straightforward negotiation. His company had been moving forward with plans that rendered his efforts meaningless. "Mr. Pike," he said finally, his voice carrying a weariness that came from having his entire worldview overturned in the span of an afternoon, "I need to ask you something directly. Are you planning to kill people?" Jedediah's response came without hesitation. "I'm planning to defend my home and the homes of my neighbors. If your company sends armed men to force us off our land, then yes, people will probably die, but I won't be the one who starts the killing." The distinction was important, Morrison realized. This wasn't about aggression or revenge. It was about protection and survival. The mountain man wasn't planning to attack Consolidated Mining's interests. He was preparing to defend against an attack that was already in progress. How many people are we talking about? How many families live up here? Jedediah moved to a detailed map mounted on the cabin's back wall, marked with locations that told the story of a scattered but connected community. 17 homesteads within a day's ride. Maybe 60 people total, including children. Plus 3 Cheyenne families who've been hunting and gathering in these mountains since before any of us arrived. Morrison studied the map, his legal training automatically assessing the situation. That's not enough to mount effective resistance against a company with Consolidated Mining's resources. They can bring in hundreds of men, federal marshals, even military support if they claim civil unrest. Numbers matter, Jedediah agreed, but they're not everything. Vietnam taught the military that you can't defeat people fighting for their homes unless you're willing to destroy everything they're defending. Question is, how far is your company willing to go? Morrison considered this, remembering conversations in corporate boardrooms where executives discussed acceptable losses and cost-benefit analyses with clinical detachment. They're willing to go as far as profit margins justify. If resistance becomes expensive enough, they'll negotiate. If it becomes cheaper to crush resistance than to deal with it, then we better make sure resistance is very expensive indeed. The mountain man returned to the table and began spreading out additional materials that Morrison hadn't noticed before. Detailed sketches of mining equipment, maps showing access routes and supply lines, even what appeared to be personnel rosters for corporate security forces. Mr. Pike, how long have you been preparing for this? Ever since the first survey stakes appeared 6 weeks ago. I've been watching, learning, planning. Your company thinks they're dealing with ignorant mountain folk who'll roll over at the first sign of serious pressure. They're about to learn otherwise. Morrison leaned forward to examine the materials more closely. The level of detail was impressive. Jedediah had identified vulnerabilities in corporate operations that professional military advisors might have missed. Supply lines stretched thin through mountain passes. Expensive equipment positioned in locations that could be easily targeted. And personnel rotations that created predictable patterns of vulnerability. This is sophisticated intelligence gathering, Morrison observed. Almost like someone who's spent 4 years studying how to disrupt enemy operations? Jedediah finished. Mr. Morrison, your company chose to invade territory defended by someone who learned warfare from professionals who were very good at their jobs. The implications were staggering. Consolidated Mining wasn't facing scattered resistance from individual homesteaders. They were confronting a coordinated defense planned and led by someone with genuine military expertise and intimate knowledge of terrain. That could neutralize most conventional advantages. There's something else you should understand, Jedediah continued, producing a folder that Morrison hadn't seen before. This isn't just about my land or even this immediate region. Your company is testing tactics they plan to use throughout the territory. If they succeed here, if they can dispossess established communities without significant consequences, they'll repeat the process everywhere. Mineral wealth makes it profitable. Morrison opened the folder to find correspondence between Consolidated Mining executives and officials from territorial government, railroad companies, and federal agencies. The documents outlined a systematic plan for acquiring vast tracts of Western land through legal manipulation, political pressure, and when necessary, organized intimidation. The scale was breathtaking and terrifying. Dry Gulch and the surrounding homesteads weren't just victims of corporate greed. They were test subjects for a process that could displace thousands of families across multiple territories. My God, Morrison whispered, scanning through page after page of calculated dispossession. They're planning to steal half the territory. Now you're beginning to understand what's really at stake, Jedediah said grimly. This isn't about one mountain community. It's about whether ordinary people have any rights that corporations are bound to respect. Morrison set the folder aside and looked directly into Jedediah's weathered face. What do you need from me? I need to know whose side you're on, came the immediate reply. Because tomorrow, your company's advance team arrives to begin formal occupation procedures. They're expecting you to have prepared the legal groundwork and neutralized any potential resistance. What are you going to tell them? The question crystallized everything Morrison had been struggling with since learning the truth about his mission. He could return to Dry Gulch, send the expected reports to his corporate superiors, and continue serving interests he now understood to be fundamentally corrupt. It would preserve his career, protect his future prospects, and keep him safely distant from the conflict that was about to engulf these mountains. Or he could choose sides based on principle rather than profit, knowing that such a choice would likely destroy everything he'd worked to build in his professional life. If I help you, Morrison said slowly, I'll be finished at Consolidated Mining. Probably blacklisted from corporate law entirely. These people have influence that extends far beyond mining operations. Jedediah nodded soberly. I understand what I'm asking. But I also understand what your company is planning to do to innocent families who've never hurt anyone. Morrison rose and walked again to the cabin window, watching as full darkness settled over the mountain landscape. Somewhere out there, children were sleeping in homes that might not exist a week from now. Families were going about their evening routines, unaware that corporate executives in distant cities had already decided their fate. Mr. Pike, if I do this, if I help you resist Consolidated Mining, I need to know that you're committed to keeping casualties to a minimum. I won't be party to unnecessary bloodshed. Neither will I, Jedediah assured him. But I also won't stand by while armed men force families from homes they've built with their own hands. If your company wants a war, they'll get one. But it will be fought on our terms, in our territory, by our rules. Morrison turned from the window to find Brimstone watching him with those intelligent brown eyes. The dog seemed to be evaluating him just as carefully as his human partner, weighing character and commitment with the instincts of a creature trained to distinguish between genuine and false signals. What specific help do you need? Morrison asked, his decision crystallizing as he spoke. Words. Jedediah smiled for the first time since Morrison had arrived at the cabin, expression that transformed his weathered features with warmth and genuine respect. First, I need accurate information about your company's timeline and resources. How many men, what kind of equipment, what their operational plans look like. Second, I need someone who can document what happens here so that if we don't survive, the truth might still get out. Third, he paused, studying Morrison's face carefully. Third, I need someone who can help coordinate legal challenges that might slow down corporate operations long enough for us to establish defensive positions. Morrison nodded slowly, understanding that he was crossing a line from which there could be no return. I can do all of that. But Mr. Pike, you should know once I commit to this course, I'll see it through regardless of personal cost. That's who I am. I was counting on it, Jedediah replied, because tomorrow, when your company's men arrive in Dry Gulch, they're going to discover that their carefully planned occupation has turned into something they never expected, a fight against people who refuse to be victims. Outside the cabin, wind through the pines carried the scent of coming change, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled a warning that echoed through mountain valleys where ancient laws still governed the relationship between predator and prey. Morrison spent the remainder of the evening helping Jedediah refine defensive plans, his legal training proving unexpectedly valuable for identifying corporate vulnerabilities and procedural weaknesses that could be exploited. As midnight approached, he realized that for the first time in his adult life, he was using his professional skills to protect rather than exploit, to defend the powerless rather than serve the powerful. The transformation felt like coming home to a version of himself he'd never known existed. Dawn came to the mountains with deceptive tranquility, painting the peaks in shades of rose and gold that spoke of beauty unmarked by human conflict. Morrison woke on Jedediah's spare cot feeling more rested than he had in months, despite the momentous decisions of the previous evening. There was something liberating about finally understanding where he stood and what he was fighting for. Jedediah was already awake, moving through his morning routine with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd lived alone long enough to waste no motion or time. Coffee was brewing, breakfast was cooking, and Brimstone had already completed his perimeter patrol of the homestead. "Company's coming," Jedediah announced without preamble as Morrison sat up. Brimstone heard them about an hour ago. 20 riders, maybe more, moving up the main trail from Dry Gulch. Morrison felt his stomach tighten. "Already? I thought we'd have more time. Your company doesn't believe in wasting daylight when there's money to be made," Jedediah replied, handing Morrison a cup of coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. "Question is, are you ready to play your part?" The plan they developed during the long evening hours was audacious in its simplicity. Morrison would return to Dry Gulch and meet with the corporate advance team, presenting himself as the loyal company representative who'd successfully prepared the ground for their operations. While maintaining that facade, he would feed critical intelligence to Jedediah and help coordinate legal challenges that could slow the corporate juggernaut. It was dangerous for both of them. If Morrison's duplicity was discovered, he'd face criminal charges for corporate sabotage, while Jedediah would lose his most valuable source of inside information about company plans and capabilities. "I'm ready," Morrison said, surprised to find that he meant it completely. The man who'd stepped off the train in Dry Gulch 3 days earlier had been consumed with advancing his career and impressing corporate superiors. The man preparing to ride back down the mountain trail was motivated by something far more fundamental: the simple recognition that some things mattered more than professional advancement. They shared a quick breakfast while finalizing the communication system they'd established. Morrison would leave coded messages at predetermined locations, using seemingly innocent business correspondence to convey vital intelligence about corporate operations. Jedediah would respond through similar channels, coordinating defensive actions that would appear to corporate observers as spontaneous local resistance rather than organized military opposition. As Morrison prepared to mount Ginger for the ride back to town, Jedediah handed him a small leather pouch that contained surveyor's stakes and metal claim markers, evidence of the illegal operations that had been conducted on private and tribal land. "Physical proof," Jedediah explained. "Keep it safe. If this situation goes badly, someone needs to be able to document what really happened here." Morrison secured the pouch in his saddlebags, understanding that he was now carrying evidence that could destroy Consolidated Mining's carefully constructed legal justifications for their acquisition campaign. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than any legal brief he'd ever carried. "Mr. Pike," Morrison said as he swung up into the saddle, "I want you to know whatever happens in the next few days. Meeting you has been the most important thing that's happened to me in years. You've shown me what it means to stand for something that matters." Jedediah's weathered face creased with what might have been a smile. "Mr. Morrison, you've got more backbone than you gave yourself credit for. Just remember, once you ride back into Dry Gulch, you're walking into the belly of the beast. Trust nobody completely. Document everything, and don't let them isolate you from potential witnesses." Morrison nodded, understanding the wisdom behind those warnings. Corporate operatives were skilled at neutralizing threats through intimidation, bribery, or, when necessary, more direct methods. His value to the mountain resistance depended entirely on maintaining his cover while gathering intelligence that could save lives. As he guided Ginger back onto the mountain trail, Morrison caught sight of dust clouds rising from the lower elevations, the unmistakable sign of a large group of riders moving at speed through the valley below. The corporate advance team was making no effort at stealth, confident in their overwhelming advantages of numbers, equipment, and legal authority. What they didn't know was that they were riding into territory defended by someone who understood exactly how to turn those apparent advantages into fatal weaknesses. The ride down the mountain gave Morrison time to prepare mentally for the performance of his life. He would need to project the confident competence of a corporate representative who'd successfully completed his advance mission, while secretly gathering intelligence that could determine whether Jedediah's small community survived or was crushed beneath the wheels of industrial progress. As the buildings of Dry Gulch came into view, Morrison could see unusual activity in the streets, more horses than normal, groups of men in traveling clothes, and the general bustle that indicated significant arrivals. The corporate machine was rolling into motion with the precision that had made Consolidated Mining one of the most successful acquisition companies in the territory. Morrison straightened in his saddle and composed his expression into the mask of professional satisfaction that was expected from a company representative returning from successful negotiations. Inside, his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, but his external demeanor projected nothing but corporate confidence as he rode into town to begin the most important deception of his life. The corporate advance team had transformed Dry Gulch's Main Street into something resembling a military staging area. Men in expensive suits moved between groups of armed guards while clerks inventoried equipment that spoke of serious intentions, surveying gear, legal documents, and enough weaponry to outfit a small army. At the center of it all stood a man whose bearing and dress marked him as someone accustomed to command. Morrison recognized the type immediately: corporate troubleshooter, the kind of executive sent when standard negotiation tactics weren't expected to succeed. This would be someone with authority to make immediate decisions and no qualms about using whatever methods proved necessary to achieve corporate objectives. Morrison. The voice carried across the street with the snap of military authority. About time you showed up. We need to talk. Morrison guided Ginger toward the speaker, a lean man in his 50s with graying hair and eyes that missed nothing. His suit was expensive but practical, cut to allow easy movement, and Morrison noticed a telltale bulge that indicated a shoulder holster beneath the jacket. Colonel Marcus Steele. The man introduced himself with a handshake that could have crushed walnuts. Consolidated Mining sent me to expedite operations in this region. I understand you've been laying groundwork for our arrival. The military title explained everything Morrison needed to know about how corporate headquarters viewed this operation. They weren't sending negotiators or bureaucrats. They were sending someone who understood warfare and wasn't afraid to apply those lessons to civilian situations. Mr. Morrison, Steele continued without waiting for a response, walk me through what you've accomplished. Local cooperation, resistance factors, legal complications. I need a complete assessment. Morrison felt the weight of Jedediah's evidence pouch against his side as he composed his response. Everything depended on convincing Steele that he remained a loyal company man while gathering intelligence that could save the mountain community. Colonel, I've had productive conversations with local leadership. Sheriff Bradley understands our legal authority. The business community recognizes the economic benefits we're offering, and most property owners seem willing to negotiate reasonable compensation. It was skillful misdirection, technically true statements that conveyed a completely false impression of local sentiment. Morrison had indeed spoken with Sheriff Bradley and the business community, though not in ways that suggested cooperation with corporate plans. Steele nodded approvingly. Outstanding. What about potential resistance? Any troublemakers we need to neutralize before proceeding? The question was asked casually, but Morrison caught the underlying threat. Corporate troubleshooters like Steele didn't view resistance as a negotiation problem. They saw it as a security issue to be resolved through intimidation or force. There's one individual who might present complications. Morrison replied carefully. Jedediah Pike, a mountain man who lives in the high country. He has significant influence with local residents and appears to have some military background. How significant? Steele's attention sharpened with professional interest. Former infantry, Civil War veteran. Lives alone, but commands respect throughout the region. If there's organized resistance, it will likely center around him. Morrison was walking a careful line, providing enough accurate information to maintain credibility while avoiding details that could help Steele neutralize Jedediah's defensive preparations. Where exactly does this Pike character live? Steele asked, producing a detailed map that Morrison recognized as far superior to any he'd seen before. About 15 miles up the main mountain trail, Morrison replied, knowing that concealing easily discovered information would only undermine his credibility. But Colonel, I should mention Pike has an unusual partnership with a German shepherd that's been trained to hunt grizzly bears. Local folks take that seriously. Steele laughed dismissively. A dog and an old hermit? Morrison, I've dealt with genuine military threats in 3 territories. One mountain man with a pet isn't going to complicate operations. The casual dismissal told Morrison everything he needed to know about how seriously corporate leadership was taking local resistance. Their arrogance was comprehensive and potentially fatal, exactly the kind of underestimation that Jedediah was counting on. Of course, Colonel. I just wanted to ensure you had complete intelligence about potential complications. Appreciated, but unnecessary, Steele replied, already turning his attention to other matters. Tomorrow morning, we begin formal acquisition procedures. I want you coordinating legal documentation while my security teams handle property inspections and resident interviews. Morrison nodded professionally while his mind raced through implications. Corporate security teams conducting resident interviews was corporate. Euphemism for intimidation tactics designed to force compliance through fear rather than negotiation. What's the timeline for completing operations? Morrison asked. 72 hours for initial acquisitions, another week for comprehensive territorial surveys. Corporate headquarters wants this region locked down before. Territorial politics can complicate our legal position. The speed was staggering. Steele was planning to dispossess an entire mountain community in less than 4 days. Such a timeline would require methods that had nothing to do with legitimate business practices and everything to do with organized coercion. I'll need detailed property records and legal documentation for review, Morrison said, maintaining his professional facade while recognizing an opportunity to gather intelligence about corporate targets. My clerk will provide everything you need, Steele assured him. Morrison, I want you to understand. This operation has full corporate backing and federal authority. Anyone who interferes with our lawful business activities will face serious consequences. The threat was unmistakable, though couched in language that could be defended in any subsequent legal proceedings. Morrison nodded his understanding while mentally composing the coded message. He would leave for Jedediah that evening. As corporate personnel continued their preparations around him, Morrison realized that the next few hours would determine whether a small mountain community survived or disappeared beneath the advancing tide of industrial expansion. Everything now depended on whether an old soldier and his bear-hunting dog could demonstrate that corporate power had limits when it encountered people willing to fight for their homes. The confrontation that would define the future of Dry Gulch and the surrounding mountain communities began at dawn on the fourth day, when Colonel Steele's security teams discovered that every corporate survey stake and claim marker in a 15-mile radius had vanished during the night. In their place, hand-carved wooden signs bore a simple message: "This land is defended. Withdraw while you can." Morrison watched from his boarding house window as Steele's carefully orchestrated operation began to unravel. The corporate teams sent to conduct resident interviews found empty homesteads not abandoned, but temporarily evacuated, with clear signs that the residents intended to return. Equipment left unguarded overnight had been sabotaged with surgical precision, damaged just enough to be unusable, but in ways that suggested intimate knowledge of mechanical vulnerabilities. Most disturbing to corporate operations was the discovery that their communications had been compromised. Telegraph lines had been cut at strategic points, isolating the corporate teams from outside support, while allowing local residents to coordinate their resistance through alternative channels that Steele's people couldn't monitor or disrupt. Morrison, Steele's voice cracked like a whip across the boarding house lobby. "Get down here. We need to discuss how your cooperative locals managed to organize overnight guerrilla operations." Morrison descended the stairs with careful composure, knowing that his performance in the next few minutes would determine whether his covert alliance with Jedediah remained secret. Steele waited in the lobby with 2 armed guards and an expression that promised unpleasant consequences for anyone found responsible for the tactical disasters of the previous night. "Colonel, I'm as surprised as you are," Morrison began, projecting confused concern. Yesterday's conversation suggested general acceptance of corporate proposals. This level of organized resistance implies coordination I didn't detect. Steele studied Morrison with the focused attention of a man trained to identify deception. "Your mountain hermit friend, Pike, what do you really know about his capabilities?" Morrison had prepared for this question, crafting an answer that would be accurate enough to maintain credibility while understating the true scope of Jedediah's strategic planning. Civil War infantry, probably some officer experience based on local respect. But Colonel, this level of tactical sophistication suggests broader organization. Pike might be coordinating resistance, but he couldn't have planned something this comprehensive alone. It was skillful misdirection that played into Steele's professional prejudices. Corporate security specialists were trained to think in terms of large-scale organization and command structures. The possibility that a single veteran with intimate terrain knowledge could orchestrate effective resistance didn't fit their operational assumptions. "Sir," one of Steele's subordinates burst through the boarding house door with news that transformed the tactical situation entirely. "We've lost contact with the advanced survey teams.
Let me know how that goes.
All 3 units missed their scheduled check-ins."
You wouldn't it with your headlamp, but
Morrison felt his blood run cold.
What does she
The
say?
plan he'd helped develop
like,
was supposed to focus on equipment sabotage and strategic harassment, not direct confrontation that could result in casualties. If Jedediah had been forced to engage corporate personnel directly, the situation was escalating beyond anyone's ability to control. Steele's reaction was immediate and decisive. "Full tactical alert. I want armed patrols sweeping those mountain trails, and I want them equipped for hostile contact. This has gone beyond business negotiations. We're dealing with organized insurrection." The transformation from corporate operation to military campaign happened with terrifying speed. Within an hour, Dry Gulch resembled an occupied town, with armed guards on every street corner and corporate personnel treating local residents as potential enemy combatants. Sheriff Bradley found himself effectively powerless as federal authority superseded local law enforcement. Morrison knew he had to act quickly. The evidence pouch Jedediah had given him represented the only hope for exposing corporate illegality
want one
before
of
the
those
situation
necklaces so I can
deteriorated
crochet while in
into
bed,
open
but at the same
warfare.
time, I
But
have
transmitting
my
that evidence
very
required
light
reaching the
status tracker. Oh my
telegraph.
God, it's so foggy
Office
outside.
past guards who were now watching everyone
I
with
did not realize how
suspicious
foggy it was. Holy
attention. The opportunity
It's hill up
came
in
when
my
Mrs.
neighbor.
Patterson approached him during the noon meal. Her expression carefully neutral,
I got
but her
ferrites in
words
my room,
carrying
which
urgent
I can use
undertones.
those if I would do want to
Mr.
crochet in
Morrison,
bed.
there's a gentleman waiting to see you in the
But,
back parlor.
I don't always
Says
want to.
it's about legal documents that need immediate attention.
Actually, we're wearing a
Morrison
hard hat,
followed
so
her through
you
the
look
boarding
like a
house
minor
to
yeah,
find
okay.
Doc
I get
Henley
you.
waiting with a medical bag and an expression of grim
A
determination.
work note in
Doc,
there, yeah.
what are you doing here?
Acrylic
Treating
from Pandora,
injuries,
albeit, but it was
Henley
buy two,
replied
get one for
quietly.
free.
3 corporate men
Well, that
found
sounds
tied
like a
up,
good deal.
but unharmed about 5 miles up the mountain
So I
trail.
understand why you got it.
Someone took their weapons and equipment, but left them with water
Yeah,
and
so I had to
directions
say,
back to
"Free?"
town.
Like that.
Your friend Pike is sending a message. The relief Morrison felt was overwhelming. Jedediah had managed to neutralize the survey teams without bloodshed,
So this should
maintaining
be
the moral high ground while demonstrating
mine?
capabilities that should give corporate forces
so it's-
serious pause
Okay.
about escalating
Sibling
the
says striped
confrontation.
works for the.
There's
that,
more,
That is very
Doc
good.
continued.
Striped is good.
Those men
Got it.
carried
I can do
documents
striped.
that Jed
Striped is
thought
much
you
easier.
should see.
I like striped. Let's
Legal
do striped.
papers authorizing the
one,
seizure
either
of private property under federal mining regulations that don't actually exist. Morrison examined the
Foggy
forged
outside and foggy
documentation
inside,
with
correct.
growing anger.
Just the way we
Consolidated
like it.
Mining wasn't just conducting illegal
Where was I?
surveys. They were operating
1, 2, 3,
under
4, 5.
fabricated
I've done 5.
federal
I've done
authority
5 rows.
that would
Congratulations to me. I
make
think
their
that's 5.
acquisition activities
No, I'm on
appear
row 5. I've not
legitimate
done
to
5
any
yet.
local officials who demanded to see proper paperwork.
Where
Doc,
was I?
I need to get this information
17,
to territorial authorities.
17.
But Steele's people are monitoring
1,
all
2, 3,
communications.
4, 5, 6,
Already
7,
taken
8,
care of,
9, 10,
Henley
11,
replied
12,
with satisfaction.
13, 14, 15,
Turns out the
16,
territorial
17.
governor's office has been
Congratulations,
wondering
me.
about
I did it.
reports of unauthorized federal
Except now I have a bunch of
operations in this
stitches.
region.
I
They
don't know where they
dispatched
came from.
investigators 3 days ago. Should be arriving on tonight's train.
Why is it asking me?
Morrison
to do so
felt
many-
pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Jedediah's resistance
need to
hadn't been
exist.
designed to defeat corporate forces through military action. It had been planned to delay CORPORAT operations
I guess that didn't
long
cause me
enough for
problems. I
legitimate
just-
legal
Yeah,
authority
okay,
to
never mind.
intervene. The mountain man's strategic thinking had been far more
Also, why you have
sophisticated
nuts and
than
guts on your
anyone
head.
realized.
Also, you see, you used to
By
have an
forcing
head section that don't
Consolidated
watch where
Mining
your
to
head is at.
reveal the true
when
nature
you
of their
work and these are around
operations
your house.
while documenting
What
their
is it you
illegal
do for work
activities,
again?
it created conditions where outside intervention became not just possible, but inevitable. As evening approached and the territorial investigators train pulled into Dry Gulch Station,
Chain once and
Morrison
chain
stood
once
on
and
Mrs.
chain one in the
Patterson's
half double.
front porch watching
Alternatively,
Colonel Steele
I could do
realized
it
that
this
his carefully planned operation had become a legal and political disaster. The man who kicked the dog as a joke had learned something about respect, courage, and the difference between real strength and corporate intimidation. More importantly,
But
he
then that's only
discovered that
difference.
sometimes the
How is
most
that in a
important
difference, though?
victories weren't won in
Did I
boardrooms
accidentally do
or
an extra
courthouses,
chain here?
but in the quiet moments when ordinary people chose to stand
No, I didn't.
for something
I
larger
was
than
just
their
working
own
through all
immediate
shit.
interests. In the mountains above Dry
Remember the class
Gulch,
I had to translate?
Jedediah
Guessing
Pike
messages
sat beside his
20 minutes
cabin
before the
fire
class said it
with
was
brimstone
cancelled.
at his side,
Well,
reading Morrison's
that
final
sucks.
coded message by lamplight. Tomorrow would bring
at
territorial
least you didn't have to teach a
investigators
bunch of kids for
federal charges
no reason.
against Consolidated Mining, and the kind of justice that couldn't be bought or intimidated. The bond between a man and
There's
his
an upside at
loyal
least.
companion had indeed run deeper than
Don't
blood
do this
deep,
one.
enough to
Right.
protect an
Why did I
entire
change it?
community
Chain
and
one.
prove that respect, once
This
earned,
one.
could move
Well
mountains.
done, me.